Welcome everybody to session 2 of the ACPF outputs and are using ACPF outputs in watershed planning and implementation. I guess I want to, you see how well prepared I am here. I'm Marcelle Lewandowski with the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, and I want to just get our minds on the topic of the day by reviewing our last session last Thursday, where we talked about Josh and Emily Zimmerman talked about a deep dive into the ACPF and how it works in ArcGIS. So I just wanted to start with getting your minds churning on that and look at your notes, either mental notes or physical notes, and just jot into the chat. What's one thing you learned there, just to help everybody get up to speed? And then the other thing is, do you have any questions from last week or any particular parts that were confusing or you need to learn more about?
Just a quick note too, I see quite a few Ann Nardies joining. That is our individuals that are in our technical course. So thanks for joining us here this morning. Those individuals are very well versed in what we covered in the first session here. But feel free to click next to your name into more and rename yourself too, so you don't have to continue to be an Ann Nardy.
As much as we love Ann Nardies around. The importance of ground verification, we'll be hearing more about that today as well. So that's the modules. The purpose of them is suggesting best practices in the field, identifying the location of opportunities. ACPF is effective for terrain analysis. That's what it does best, but does not produce water quality results or estimates of water quality. How to adjust the inputs to make ACPF best fit local conditions. That's a really big one.
Yeah, the defaults can only do so much. You know, you're using the tools in your area. It's going to be, you're going to have a better idea as to what the parameters should be for each of those tools.
Yes, so make sure if your GIS technician is working with somebody who really knows the area and the landscape. Recognize that there are a number of criteria that must be considered under the practice modules. Yep, that's in that same bucket. Cell by cell terrain processing. Yeah, it's what ArcGIS raster analysis is doing is each little pixel, it's calculating what how many pixels are contributing to that pixel and to estimate water flow and model water flow. Any questions? What were the parts of last week that you were completely, or not completely, or partially confused by and feel like I need to figure out more before I'm really comfortable with this thing? Imagine if you were explaining it to one of your colleagues or to somebody at a community meeting. Well, as these questions come up throughout this session today, don't hesitate to ask more questions. For today, so last week you went into the technical details of all this. At this session, we're going to get into some in-depth case examples, and Carl Gesch is going to start. He's at Wisconsin DNR right now, but he was working in Iowa, and he's got a number of examples from both states to share. And then Kevin Keener will talk about the Root River watershed in Minnesota, and Joe Magner will talk about Beargrass Creek in Indiana. And each of these cases are real different, and I encourage you to have these questions in your mind as you're listening. Who was it that ran the ACPF? Who helped field check it? Who are the people involved? When did ACPF get pulled in to the whole conservation and planning and implementation process? How were the outputs, the ACPF outputs presented? And what was the other information and tools that were used along with the ACPF outputs? Because nobody uses this alone. It's always linked to some other information. And the big one, why? Why did they use it? And what was the value of it? What did it add to the whole conservation planning and implementation process? Any questions before we jump in, or should I hand off to Carl Gesch? All right, Carl, you're on. Oh, wait, let me see.
Great, thank you, Marcel. I will share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Looks good.
All right, great. Well, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to share. So like Marcel mentioned, kind of wearing an old hat and a newer hat today. And I'll be sharing with you all some examples from Iowa and Wisconsin. So excited to dive in and just share some of my experience with ACPF. Okay, so starting with a couple of take-home messages, use ACPF to prioritize your outreach, whether it's for a certain type of practice or a certain location within your watershed. There's some really valuable ways that you can apply the outputs of running the tools for your watershed. And then second, adapt ACPF to meet your watershed's needs. Watersheds are very diverse places, even within an individual state. So knowing that and using what ACPF has to offer and incorporating that with other elements of your watershed or your program, if you're working at a broader scale, can be really impactful. So think about these two items as I go through these examples with your watershed or your state program in mind, and think about ways to plug in ACPF and how it can be used to prioritize some outreach and engagement with the stakeholders of your program or watershed. Okay, so first we will talk about Iowa. For about 5 years, I worked in Iowa as primarily a watershed planner with the Iowa Soybean Association, and got to work with a lot of farmers in writing small local scale watershed plans. So in this case study, I'll be talking about a Huck 12 watershed in Northwest Iowa, where farmers were implementing the nutrient reduction strategy or seeking for ways to scale up that adoption, particularly conservation drainage practices like saturated buffers and bioreactors and wetlands. I won't be talking about the practices today, but in great detail, but that is a point of emphasis for that part of the world based on Iowa's landscape. Okay, so for a little bit of context before we get into what happened in this case. So partners across Iowa are using the watershed approach to implement the state nutrient reduction strategy. So like many other states in the Mississippi River Basin, this is related to the Stoner Memo, Gulf hypoxia, et cetera, with goals to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loads by 45%. In Iowa, the portion assigned to agriculture, or the goals for agriculture for nitrogen and phosphorus reduction, are 41% nitrogen load reduction and 29% phosphorus load reduction. So those goals work themselves into local watershed plans quite a bit, as we will get into in a few minutes here. The approach that Iowa is using to implement the nutrient reduction strategy is they have priority Huck 8 watersheds, and those are outlined in blue on the map on the right side of your screen. And then within those priority Huck 8 watersheds, there are demonstration projects where there is a watershed coordinator as a local staff person, the boots on the ground, if you will, to manage that watershed project, work with farmers, sign them up for practices, provide outreach, things like that. And the state also provides funding for cost share for the practices themselves. One of the key elements of that approach in Iowa is that for those demonstration projects and many others, watershed plans have been and are being written to identify local implementation pathways and possibilities for implementing and adopting Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy across the landscape in these priority watersheds. Like I mentioned in my former role, worked with a lot of farmers to bring them into the planning process, give them a seat at the table to identify local resource concerns and incorporate their knowledge of the watershed. And really important to have the folks who own and operate the land, working the landscape in the room from square one when you start writing the watershed plan. So that's been a successful model for Iowa. So in writing those watershed plans focused on the nutrient reduction strategy, we sought to address three important questions. The first one of those is what? So what to do? What are the priority actions that are recommended in the watershed plan? And to answer what question, we used farmer input, like I just described. The second question is how much? How much implementation is necessary to meet water quality goals like the nutrient reduction strategy? And this is where the science assessment of Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy comes in, and I'll describe that in a little more detail momentarily. And then the final question in this recipe, if you will, is where. And this is where ACPF comes in as a very robust tool to help identify potentially feasible locations for the priority practices at the needed levels to meet water quality goals. So integrating those three pieces together is the recipe that we were using to develop local management plans for watersheds. So as a case study, I will be describing Headwater Cedar Creek watershed. And if you can see my cursor, it's the one in the red circle here in Northwest Iowa. So it's in the North Raccoon River watershed in the Des Moines lobe, which is a recently glaciated landscape with really poor surface drainage. So heavily tile drained landscape. Much of the stream in this Headwaters watershed is actually a drainage ditch, as you can see on this picture on the front of the watershed plan document. So that's the landscape that we were working in. In a series of planning meetings with farmers from the watershed, from this one Huck 12, the farmers set these 4 goals on the right side of your screen for the watershed plan. Those are to sustain agricultural profitability and productivity, to reduce soil erosion, and then the 2 Iowa nutrient reduction strategy goals for nitrogen and phosphorus, 41% nitrogen reduction and 29% phosphorus load reduction. The next question is how much? This chart is taken from the science assessment in Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy. It shows on average how these various conservation practices are expected to perform in terms of nitrogen load reduction relative to the baseline of no conservation practice on that particular field. So knowing that some practices have greater nitrogen reduction benefits than others, and that there are associated implementation needs and costs with all of those practices, it allowed the farmers and the watershed planning team to balance costs and benefits associated with each of these different practices, and to start to turn the dials, as it were, to identify how many of various combinations of practices would be needed to be reasonably expected to meet nutrient reduction strategy goals for this particular watershed. Final question was where. We ran ACPF for the watershed. And this map shows all of the outputs from the tool for the watershed. So you may have heard Mark Tomer refer to the menu of conservation practice options. So this map shows the menu for the watershed. Knowing what we knew about the watershed, the specific landscape, the input and discussions we had with farmers while writing the watershed plan, it was clear that not all of this would be necessary, and frankly, would not be a cost-effective way to go about implementing conservation in the watershed to meet the nutrient reduction strategy goals. So integrating these three pieces, what to do, how much to do, and where to do it, we pieced together this watershed conceptual plan for implementation. And I'll draw your attention to the legend on the left of the map. Each of these practices is mapped in the HUC 12 with a potential location along with the needed level of implementation. That's the number in parentheses. AC is acres to meet the nutrient reduction strategy goals for nitrogen phosphorus loss reduction in the watershed. So as you can see by looking at the map, there's color everywhere. So at least something is recommended on essentially all cropland in the watershed. So a very ambitious watershed plan, certainly, but by knowing the potentially feasible locations and the needed levels of these various practices, it allowed the local watershed coordinator and other conservation staff to really prioritize their outreach to farmers and landowners in the watershed, with special emphasis on these conservation drainage practices, namely saturated buffers and bioreactors. Within the first 18 months, they were about, I think about 15% of the way to their overall goal of implementation and associated modeled nitrogen loss reductions. And it was a 15-year watershed plan that was completed in 2016. So they were well ahead of pace in scaling up implementation of this specific type of practice. So lots of good success there. And the watershed plan and the ACPF outputs provided a really informational tool for the local watershed staff to work with landowners and identify which landowners to work with to get these practices on the ground. All right, that is what I have for Iowa. We will now pivot to Wisconsin, where I think this is a pretty diverse example compared to what we were just talking about, where the goal of a watershed partnership was to improve trout habitat in a trout stream in Northwest Wisconsin. So here in Dunn County and St. Croix County in Wisconsin, the Wilson Creek and Annis Creek Watershed Partnership used ACPF as part of their overall process. The primary goal of the partnership was to improve water quality and to protect trout streams in the watershed. This was a diverse partnership that included county conservation staff, NRCS, DNR, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and NRCS, along with local landowners to work towards those goals. One thing that this group did was they combined the ACPF outputs with the outputs of eval. This is EVAAL, the Erosion Vulnerability Assessment for Agricultural Lands tool. So this is a Wisconsin-specific tool that is similar but complementary to ACPF. So what the eval tool does is it is used to assess erosion in a HUC 12 watershed. So it's designed to work at the same scale based on analyzing high resolution digital elevation models, just like ACPF, but the focus is on erosion. So it's really useful for identifying fields that are most prone to erosion, including concentrated flow erosion. So by combining the erosion outputs from eval with the riparian corridor assessment in particular from ACPF, they were able to identify some priority areas for practices that reduce sediment loss including stream bank protection based on some of the riparian corridor analysis from the ACPF toolbox. And what the group did was they used the outputs of those two tools to develop a mailing list based on priority locations and really targeted their outreach to specific locations based on the geographic data available for the watershed. And that led to lots of really great conservation adoption in the watershed. They installed over 1,000 meters of grassed waterways, and over 3 miles of the riparian corridor were protected, leading to improved habitat for the trout in the stream. So I know I went through that pretty quickly, but that is all I have. Marcel and Anne, I don't know if you want to take questions later or if you want me to address questions now. I'm happy to do it either way.
No, I think it would be great to take questions now. If you, as you were listening to Carl, thinking back to those questions, who ran the ACPF? When was it used in the whole planning and implementation process? How was it used? How was it presented? What kind of maps were used and what other information was integrated? And what good was it? Why were they using it? Any questions come up in your mind as you're thinking about that and you start to think about how to apply this to your own situation? Matthew from Ohio says, can you describe again the outreach process you mentioned at the beginning?
Yeah, you bet, Matthew. And if my answer doesn't capture your question, be sure to let me know. So the outreach process with engaging farmers in watershed planning, stop me in my tracks if that's not what you want me to talk about. But yeah, so worked with local conservation staff to identify landowners in the watershed and invite them to watershed planning meetings through mailings, phone calls, word of mouth, and get those folks to the table to participate in the plan development process.
He says, how did you market the outreach meetings?
In terms of marketing the outreach meetings, so the watershed planning meetings, we used mailings to invite the landowners and then follow-up phone calls to farmers and landowners in the watershed. So time intensive, but once you get some folks to the table for the first meeting, then they invite their neighbors or bring a friend or a family member who they farm with, and that definitely helps.
And who were those letters and phone calls coming from?
In this case, they came from the Iowa Soybean Association, from me.
Jill Costell from Illinois says, who did the ground truthing? Was the tool rerun based on field feedback?
Yeah, good question. So the ground truthing was also completed by me. We did some field assessments in the Headwater Cedar Creek watershed, including we floated the stream and took an inventory of many natural resource concerns, or a number of natural resource concerns along the stream corridor. But the one of primary interest for this particular watershed, given the prevalence of tile drainage, was the location of drainage tile outlets into the drainage ditch or the stream. And that served as a really good way to validate that the fields where we were seeing saturated buffers and bioreactors being recommended by ACPF did in fact have drainage tile outlets. And this, I think we actually ran an earlier version of the ACPF tool when the saturated buffer tool, siting tool, was new. So it was kind of cool timing to be able to field verify what that tool was telling us. We also did a windshield survey of the watershed, looking at tillage practices and cover crop prevalence as well. But we did not rerun the tool at all. But the assessments provided additional information to ground truth what we saw with ACPF. Looks like the next question is about reservations once farmers and landowners were in the meeting. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think sometimes, especially at the start of a watershed planning process, where even as a farm organization, inviting farmers to the meeting, there was just a lot of question marks of what's going on, what are we signing up for, what is this going to mean for us? So yeah, there's a bit of uncertainty, but or there was in this particular case, but working with the farmers to address those questions, talk about how what they're doing locally relates to the bigger picture of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, what it can mean for long-term profitability on their farms by adopting soil health practices and the like, was a way that we addressed that. Oops. Not sure if you all can see my screen, but I'm having some trouble scrolling through the questions.
I'm happy to read them. Seth says, what sources did you use to match nitrogen reductions to ACPF derived practices?
Yeah, good question, Seth. So picture that bar chart based on the science assessment and Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy. I spoke about this pretty quickly, but the science assessment and the nutrient reduction strategy in Iowa includes an average practice reduction efficiency, an average nitrogen and phosphorus loss reduction efficiency for all of the various practices. So we just use a simple spreadsheet modeling approach for anticipated number of acres treated based on ACPF results and what we would expect to see in terms of water quality improvement.
Then he asked, did you get any pushback from landowners and farmers on targeting and siting practices on their property?
Yeah, good question. I did use the word targeting a couple of times in my presentation today, Seth, but in general, that was a word that I think I probably tried to avoid when working with farmers. Tend to prefer prioritize. I know that's a subtle difference, but it can resonate differently with various individuals. One thing that you can come back to as well is that ACPF provides options to farmers for consideration to match what's needed in the watershed, what the conditions are on their farm. So it provides it puts their farm into context of the watershed as a whole. And that's why thinking about the watershed planning process more broadly than just ACPF was helpful as well, because we did give farmers the opportunity to have their voices heard and express their preferences for the watershed plan. But yeah, definitely a concern worth addressing.
How is the practice selection and optimization done to reach a target nutrient reduction? I know ACPF doesn't predict practice performance. Is it possible that you end up with more than needed conservation planning within a watershed?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I think that's a little related to the one I just spoke about. There was no, we didn't use a model for any optimization. So I would say we came up with one potentially feasible scenario that could be implemented. It is possible that that recommended implementation scenario could be more conservation than needed. Whether it's 17,500 acres of cover crops, 15,000 acres of cover crops, 25,000 acres of cover crops, plus a few dozen edge of field treatment practices. I think the takeaway message is that lots of conservation is needed throughout the watershed. But yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that we used a robust model to come up with a precise number.
Does the tool located identified sites that had already been under some form of conservation practice, saturated buffers, bioreactors, et cetera? Yeah,
that's a good question. Short answer is no. So those conservation practices are still new enough that most of those locations are known, just because there's only, well, there's increasingly more of them in Iowa as they continue to scale up these practices. At the time that we wrote this watershed plan, there were no saturated buffers or bioreactors in the watershed.
And Iowa has that interesting situation where you've identified a lot of existing practices across the state. Carl, are you able to explain that? Or I don't know if that was before.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I wasn't related with that project at all, but Iowa had I think they called it the BMP mapping project. And Josh may be able to talk about it more, not to put you on the
Yep.
spot, Josh, but
Nope,
it
I
was,
can.
or yeah, maybe I'll just let you talk about it. You were more involved than I was.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was run out of our GIS facility at Iowa State in conjunction with the DNR, Department of Ag and Land Services. And essentially, we went through every watershed in the state using the LiDAR that we had from 07 to 2010 to identify 6 forms of best management practices, BMPs, grass waterways, wascobs, terraces, pond dams, strip cropping, and contour buffer strips. So we make those readily available to the public. Those, obviously are only up till 2010, so a lot of them are going to be possibly out of date, especially, wascobs or especially contour buffer strips and strip cropping as, fields turn over. But those were available to anybody to use, and so they're a good resource to compare the results of the ACPF tools towards what is potentially there already.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So at the time that we wrote this watershed plan in 2016, that BMP mapping project was not yet completed across the state. But more recently, some of the watershed plans that I helped to write, we did use those results along with field assessment information about tillage practices, cover crops, tile inventories to get a more complete picture of the current levels of conservation implementation in the watershed. And that factored into the recommended level of practice implementation in the watershed conceptual plan as practices that have already been done and the associated nutrient reductions. So yes, we did incorporate that information as available.
We have another question here. Was there a situation where you had to go back and rerun ACPF based on farmer stakeholder inputs and ended up with a different than previous conservation plan?
No, not that I recall during my time in Iowa. Trying to think of how we most used the farmer input to inform the ACPF runs themselves. Honestly, the primary way that we used ACPF to fit into the watershed planning process in Iowa was to inform the watershed plan and inform the discussions with farmers, more so than the other way around. It was a valuable planning tool at the watershed scale and a conversation tool with farmers at the individual level. But for the most part, we used it to identify the capacity of the landscape for different types of practices and to ensure that what the farmers were telling us were their priorities based on their knowledge of the ground in the watershed, aligned with what the ACPF was telling us. So we did integrate the input that way.
I think this is a good example of people use ACPF at different stages and for different purposes. And I encourage you, Vinayak, to bring that question up again with Joe Magner. So you might, so as you listen to these other speakers. Any other questions for Carl?
Well, I've got my contact information there. Feel free to send me a note or give me a call. I'm happy to chat more. Sorry, I see one more question. Do you have to rank BMP applications to best utilize available funding? Good question. I personally was not involved in that. The local conservation staff in the Soil and Water Conservation District and the County NRCS office did rank applications. And I am not aware of the degree to which ACPF was a part of that ranking process. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Sorry, I don't have more information on that.
Thank you, Carl. Now I am pleased to hand over control to Kevin Keener, who is with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and has been working in southeast Minnesota for a very long time on this well-established project, which I always find interesting. And I think I will just hand over to Kevin and let you explain what you're doing down in the Root River.
Thanks, Marcel. I'll try to share my screen here. All right, is that showing up okay?
It hasn't switched to the slideshow yet, but I wonder if it's getting there. If there's a delay. We can see the slides. It's just, it hasn't switched to slideshow presentation view. It's funny, it doesn't seem to be switching.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a delay here. Okay. Anything there?
No, it's still sitting,
Okay.
which isn't terrible.
All right, I'll try this again. Did that work?
No, is anybody else seeing it? Maybe it's just me.
No, I might, oh, wait, I just, I
Now
spoke
it's
to you
there.
and it just
Okay.
worked.
Now I got it.
You got it? Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thanks, Marcel. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, I'm going to share a case study that took place a while ago, back in we started this back in 2014, kind of when ACPF was first kind of being tested and evaluated. Had the opportunity to work with Mark, and actually Marcel and I went to the same workshop down at Iowa State. So this is kind of a unique project. It's a special research and demonstration project that's taking place in the southeast corner of Minnesota in the Root River watershed. And so how we applied ACPF was more on an individual basis, and I'll kind of highlight the approach that was used for that. Is my next slide showing there, Marcel?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So, I think all of us, working in watershed management and water quality related projects, I think have this overarching goal of, trying to integrate practices in our watersheds and then try to measure that response in terms of improvement. And, a lot of the research and the data suggests that, we really do need these practices to be really targeted in a way that are in the right place at the right time, and that they're at the proper level of density to be able to see some of those changes at the watershed scale. And we also recognize that you need an exceptional amount of landowner support and participation in that process. And those of you that have been involved with watershed work or working in watersheds, it really is a social science as much as we have the technical side. Really, the big half of this is, or huge part of it is the social aspect of it. And a lot of it is really trying to sell some of these practices in these watersheds. And that, of course, that process can be complex, as this warning sign, kind of highlights here. So our approach, given kind of those two things, our approach was to really prioritize what we call these high runoff risk areas, or also called critical source areas, in small watersheds using the ACPF tool. We used a student worker to process a lot of the ACPF back in 2014. We then in turn hired a contracted field specialist who was a retired soil and water conservation technician to actually go out there and start having those conversations with farmers in these priority watersheds. And we utilized a field walkover approach to kind of start those conversations with those farmers. We use a combination of state, federal, and private cost share programs. And those were administrated by the local soil and water districts and NRCS offices. And through our program, we continue to monitor and evaluate the effect of this effort. So we're hoping over time that we'll be able to see if this if this actually had any effect on the water quality over time. So this is the study area that we're looking at. So this is in the southeast corner of Minnesota, or in the northwest portion of what we call the driftless area. And the root is really interesting in that it's a very complex and very diverse watershed. Out of all the watersheds in the state, I would say the root is probably one of the more complex ones. And the reason for that is the root can be kind of separated into three primary landscapes. To the west, we have the glacial till landscape that benefits from tile drainage. In the center portion of the watershed, we have sinkholes and disappearing streams and karst. And then as we move towards the east, towards the Mississippi, we have basically karst, but we have that steeper topography in the bluffland area. And so given that, about 12, 13 years ago, we started having conversations with farmers, in the watershed. And, a lot of questions came up about, how much loss is actually occurring and where is it coming from? How much is actually coming from ag fields versus other sources? And so we started this project. It was called the Field to Stream Partnership, to better answer and help address some of those questions that our farmers and landowners had in this watershed. And given the complexity of this watershed, what we decided to do was select 3 small sub-watersheds, very small watersheds, less than 5,000 acres in size, to get at some of these questions. And there's about 50 farmers covering about 10,000 crop acres within these small sub-watersheds that were selected. And within those small watersheds, we have intensive sampling and monitoring that's occurring. It's probably one of the most intensive projects that we have within the state and most comprehensive at this particular scale. So we have edge of field monitoring combined with in-stream monitoring, along with a lot of other types of monitoring occurring for groundwater that's occurring within these small watersheds. And one thing that we've really learned, so this monitoring began in 2010. So we now have over 12 years of data on this, in these small watersheds. And during this baseline period, this baseline phase of the study, one of the things that really stands out to us, and then also to the farmers that we share this information with, is getting at this question of when do we see this runoff occur and when do we see most of the loss occur? And it really highlights this concept of critical time periods. And what we find is in the data, the last 10 years at least, we've seen that between 53 to 74% of our annual soil and associated nutrient loss in that surface runoff at the field scale is occurring in just those 2 months alone. And when we look at pesticide loss coming out of these small watersheds, we find that nearly 90% of that loss occurs during those 2 months alone. And so it kind of gets at this point that we really have to be thinking about what practices are going to be really effective during those 2 months out of the year, if indeed most of that is occurring during that time period. The other really important concept that we try to convey to our farmers with these data is that this concept of high risk areas, or another term that's often used is critical source areas. And these are basically just areas of a field or watershed that yield a disproportionate amount of our sediment and nutrient loss. And so for a given amount of runoff, we can contribute a lot of soil or attached nutrients to that soil in those areas or those locations. And a really good example of that is, something that we can see pretty easily is ephemeral gully erosion. And we had a really unique opportunity to actually quantify the effect of these critical source areas or these high risk areas. And so what you're seeing here is in this chart, this is the cumulative soil loss over this 8-year record. And these are from 4 different fields. And you see that field 4, the cumulative sediment loss, you see this kind of stair-step pattern that we see starting in about 2013. And what happened is we had an ephemeral gully form on the outside edge of an existing grass waterway. And so every time you see this big jump in here, that's essentially telling you that ephemeral gully was active at that period. And what we find is when we compare field 4 to field 2, which had very similar management, similar climate, rainfall, and all those things, we find that field 4 had over 3 times more soil loss compared to field 2. And the reason being, part of it being because of this ephemeral gully that had formed there. So it really kind of highlighted this point that it's really important to try to target those areas. Certainly this was a symptom of some other practices that were occurring within the field too, but it just highlights that these ephemeral gullies are very efficient at transporting that sediment and excess nutrients off of the field. So in a way, they're kind of like conveyor belts. So with that said, and with that data, that really kind of provided the foundation for why we chose what we did when we kind of used the ACPF tool and really focused during the implementation phase. And so for our ACPF, our targeting, we really focused on the stream power index, which is a function of the slope and the drainage area to those areas, and essentially, determining the erosion risk in those concentrated flow areas. And a really good tool for helping identify the potential for ephemeral gully erosion to occur, and also to target, of course, practices like grass waterways and other similar practices. Another really key output that we used and found to be very, very useful was the runoff risk output tool. And what this is it's a very simplistic, very effective tool, but it's essentially a function of both slope and distance to stream. And obviously, if you have both of those come together, you're going to have a much higher risk for that delivery of that sediment to get to the area that you're trying to protect. So obviously, it's always important to kind of verify that, in the field or, through other methods such as aerial photography. And what's really interesting kind of in this example, this particular field that was identified in this watershed was the most critical in terms of the runoff risk category. And this is aerial photography just taken from Google Earth. But you can see here that we had quite a few of these ephemeral gullies on this particular field. And so it really kind of collaborated, I guess, the imagery along with the runoff risk output really kind of gelled together and sort of indicated that, yes, this definitely was actually, verified within the field as well. But, that's through imagery, and obviously that you can only get so far with that. And the other thing is it's great, these tools are just, incredible, in terms of ability to leverage the technology and especially the LiDAR data. But, ultimately the big question I think that we all have is, how do we actually deliver this to our farmers? And as Marcel and others have talked about, there's all kinds of different approaches to do that. And what I'm going to kind of share with you is definitely this approach probably may or may not apply to your situation. So keep that in mind. But this is the approach that we end up going with to try to get conversations with our farmers to talk about these areas. And so that kind of opens up this concept of what we called a field walkover. And so, you know, the big challenge that we had is like, what's going to be our best approach? Because we had all this great data and we have this unique opportunity to implement targeted practices and actually monitor the effectiveness of that effort through this really detailed effort and monitoring effort. And so we wanted to make sure whatever approach that we used, we wanted to make sure it was really well thought out and that we took our time and we didn't rush into it. Because I think so many cases, you know, that first impression is everything to a landowner or to a farmer. And so if you're not really prepared or really well thought out, obviously, you know, people are going to read that, and that could impact, you know, future success in terms of your engagement with those landowners and producers. So we really took a lot of time and effort, actually meant 2 to 3 years of time to really think about this approach. And around this time, we were also collaborating with the group in Wisconsin Discovery Farms. And they were also kind of testing out a program, which basically is a very simple approach, conservation planning approach, to basically start that conversation with landowners and farmers about targeting these certain locations in these high priority areas. And so really what it is, the field walkover is really just a field level visual assessment of erosion and erosion potential. But it's also kind of a way to validate the ACPF tool. And so here you can kind of see here, this is a map of one of our field specialists, Ron Miners, that was hired for this particular project. And then this is one of our farmer leaders, Kent Dornick. And so Ron is basically testing this out with Kent to see how this process is going and get feedback from Kent, and you know, kind of going through some of the maps, figure out which ones are most useful, which ones aren't so useful, and getting that feedback from Kent. And that was very important for us to go through that process with kind of our local, what we call our farmer leaders and advisors through that process. The other kind of really important process for all this was to inventory existing practices that the farmers were already using, because we wanted to make sure that those farmers were getting credit for the practices that they were already doing. But at the same time, we also recognize that some of those practices are probably 30, 40, or 50 years old, and that some of them are probably going to need a little bit more TLC and an additional you know, rehabilitation to make sure that they're working properly. But if you want to get more information about kind of more information about the field walkover approach, there's a really nice guide that Wisconsin Discovery Farms put together that highlights some of that, really written in a way for a producer or a landowner to kind of do this on their own. But, you know, really nice flow charts and really nice pictures that really does a nice job kind of explaining the process. But essentially what we did is we kind of integrated the ACPF into that walkover process. Now, one thing I will say is that we found that, you know, kind of showing those maps wasn't really necessary to do in those conversations. If the landowner asked about it, you know, certainly we would show them, give them those maps, but primarily it was used in the background. And it was primarily used for Ron to kind of train himself before he went out into the field to do those walkovers, to identify and prioritize which areas of the farm that he should really look at. Because Ron literally walked and where he could used a four-wheeler, but literally, you know, tried to get across every acre of those farms and those study watersheds. And so it was really important for him to really prioritize and focus on those areas that could be most beneficial. This next slide just kind of highlights the steps that were involved in the field walkover process. And I kind of just want to really highlight, I'm not going to go in a lot of detail of this, but I did send a link to Marcel, and if you want to share that with the group, but it's a PDF that basically highlights the same thing. But it really just highlights what I kind of want to point here is that the walkovers themselves didn't start until about step 6. And so if you look at all of these steps before that, there were quite a few steps that were involved before we actually set foot and started to talk with some of those farmers in those study watersheds. There was a lot of relationship building, and there was an advisory team that was built before a lot of this occurred. Of course, running the ACPF took some time, hiring the field specialist took some time. We kind of, before Ron actually went out there and started to talk with the farmers, we actually had our farmer leaders send a letter to their neighbors, encouraging them to think about this walkover approach and to be open to this approach of having Ron come to their farms, talk about this, and be able to get the conversation going about targeting some of these areas. So just want to kind of highlight that. So a lot of steps involved and a lot of communication, a lot of multiple interactions with those farmers through that process. The other thing that really stood out to us in our kind of our pre-testing of all of this with our farmer leaders was, emphasis of keeping it simple, keeping it as simple and straightforward as possible. And so we kind of devised, and again, this is not anything to base your work on. I mean, I think every watershed and situation is different, but this is what worked for us. But this was just a simple one-page report that kind of highlighted a couple of key things. One of them was to highlight the beneficial practices that the farmer was doing. That was really important to really highlight that, because we didn't want to just highlight the negative. We wanted to also highlight the good things that those farmers were doing, but then also highlight those opportunities for improvement. And then really boiling it down to how many practices were we talking about? And then ultimately to the farmer, they wanted to know, of course, well, how much is it going to cost? And then to boil that down to, okay, let's prioritize that, because a lot of these practices may not be necessary, like within an immediate time period. And so we kind of used the stoplight approach of like red being something you should probably address within the next 1 to 2 years, yellow being, probably put it on kind of on your list of things that you should try to tackle within the next 5 years. And then green, of course, just acknowledging it's a great practice, keep up the maintenance on it, and just highlighting that. And again, ACPF was really critical in really this prioritization process, especially, prioritizing some of this. Now, certainly, that's a key thing, because, and I think something that our farmers really appreciated is that ACPF is a very objective sort of tool. There really isn't a lot of subjectivity to it. And that's what I think our farmers really appreciated, that it wasn't a lot of subjectivity to it. But with that said, it does take someone like Ron, who's got, a career, a background history, career as a retired soil and water district technician, having that sense of, what works and what doesn't work in certain situations, and having that, that personal experience that goes along with that. And so there's a video, if you're interested, that kind of, it's a short 8-minute video that kind of highlights Ron and some of the work that he did, and some testimonials from some of the farmers in these watersheds. So you can, I think, Marcel, I also included that as a link too, that you can use. So to kind of wrap it up here, I'll just kind of highlight, so did this process work? So this was the results from the walkover approach. We were very fortunate to get 100% participation by those farmers. So there's roughly about 50 farmers in those 3 small watersheds that we were targeting. And Ron, when he did the walkover, he found that he identified a potential of 400 potential conservation projects on those farms. But really, when you boiled it down to which ones would be kind of the highest priority, and those that probably have the highest risk for runoff and actual observed, ground truth type of issues, about 25% of those, so about 100 of those sites would be categorized as a very high priority. And what was really interesting, and this is something that was really interesting to all of us, was that about 30% of those high priority practices were practices that the landowners already had on their farms. It's just that they weren't working, working very well. They basically had kind of exceeded their life expectancy in terms of their effectiveness for sediment trapping or what have you. And I think to our farmers, that was a really low hanging fruit that, let's start there and let's get those areas fixed first. And then move on to those other, new practices within the watershed. And, by far the most common practice needs that were identified were either new or repairs to existing grass waterways, getting back on the contour, perhaps reducing a tillage pass on some rotations. And then another big one was grade stabilization, especially along cropland ravine interfaces and outlets of existing grass waterways. And what was really interesting is through that walkover process, did those farmers actually respond to fixing some of those high priority locations? And, again, this was really a collaborative effort between the SWCD, the NRCS, and Ron, and just all of our partners in this. But I think it really just highlights the good positive story here that I think if farmers are approached the right way, and given the right tools and given the right technical assistance and so forth, and the right amount of time, that they will respond. And I think this is a really good example of that 70% of those farmers added additional targeted practices on their farms as a result of that process. Not 100%, but it was still, in terms of, as many of you know, working in watersheds, it's tough to get that 100% mark, but it's, getting that level is really a nice, great positive outcome there. What's really interesting is that a third of those farmers that did add more practices on their ground, they actually kind of went above and beyond what was being asked of them. And in this case, what they did is they not only addressed their highest priority sites, but they also addressed kind of those moderate priority sites. And so they basically addressed everything on their farm in terms of some of their resource needs. And I think that kind of highlights this point of, like Ron would say, he'd say, while the bulldozer is out here, why don't we go ahead and fix, area B and C also on the farm while we're out here. And that was tended to be kind of what would happen in those conversations with the farmer is kind of, let's fix this, but while we're out here, let's also fix these other locations. The other interesting thing was that 27% of the farmers did not utilize cost share. They basically used their own money out of their own pocket to address this. And part of it was because in their view, it was just a much faster and simpler process rather than going through some of the hoops that they had to go through for cost share. And some of them are just very independent and just wanted to do it on their own, which was great, just to see that level of commitment by them. I think what was really interesting is that relatively very small investment in both, that field specialist, in this case, Ron, combined with that student worker that did the ACPF, roughly that was a total of about $50,000 investment over that 2-year period. But that $50,000 investment resulted in 1.8 million in conservation cost assistance to those producers in those small watersheds. And that was all done within about a 5-year period. These are just some of the practices that were installed on those small watersheds, about 100,000 feet of linear grass waterways, both new waterways and repairs to existing ones, 16 water sediment control basins, 200 plus acres of prairie strips and buffers and targeted perennials, some high priority feedlot fixes, and then kind of rehabilitation of existing dam structures that had a lot of stored sediment, and to kind of rehabilitate some of those structures. And I think this one was a really a great story here. This was actually one of the highest runoff risk sites identified in that watershed through ACPF, and through those conversations with the producer. That producer decided to install some grade stabilization structures and some new grass waterways and enrolled part of that field into the Conservation Reserve Program. And so, really, in a sense, that field is now been completely addressed, and we feel that that one field likely had a very significant impact on the stream itself. And so we're really excited to see what effect that may have on our water quality over time. So I guess kind of in closing, I guess some of the things that I want to kind of reflect on are some of the lessons learned and advice that I would give if based on our experience with this, is that I think it goes to show that it really does take a lot of time, and I can't emphasize enough that the amount of time that you need to invest in building relationships is so key to all of this. And I think that really dictates many times how much work can be done in some of these watersheds. So investing that time on the front end is really critical in terms of building relationships with some of those farmers, and probably also to start small and to start slow. One thing that we ran into was that we identified a lot of projects and got a lot of projects going really fast in a very short amount of time. And that can quickly, outstrip the capacity of the technical resources that you have to design the waterway or implement the actual waterway. And that was something that we really wanted to try to avoid, because as a producer or a farmer, you don't want to have to wait, 2 or 3 years before that practice actually gets put on the ground. So in many cases, they want it done, maybe within the next 6 months, or do it when it's going to work best for their cropping rotation. So, trying to keep that level of customer service can be challenging if you line up too many projects all at once, which can be it's a good problem to have, but at the same time, it can create some challenges with publics and customer service. And I think the last point I kind of want to highlight is just this concept of conventional random acts of conservation versus this precision conservation delivery model. And if you are going to look, and I think really both are needed. In our watersheds, we really need to address people that walk through the door to our soil and water offices to address conservation needs. But we also need to be thinking about this precision conservation delivery model. But if you are going to be implementing that more precise model, you really do need to really up your game when it comes to customer service. And it also just takes an incredible amount of time and frequent interactions with those producers. With that precision model. And again, it's very time and people intensive. And, and I think in our case, having that dedicated field specialist was really key, to making that work. So with that, I will, turn it back, Marcel. Hopefully I'm good on time here. And if there's time, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
You do have a number of questions rolling in here, and Kevin, I really appreciate hearing this, because it's a great example of how ACPF, which is a watershed tool, is useful at working at the farm scale. And I know not everybody can do that comprehensive of a project that Kevin is involved in here, but think about how ACPF information could feed into, say, your NRCS local office, and you've got people walking in the door. If you were prepared with this kind of information for whoever walks in the door, think about the opportunities there. So starting with the questions, Rebecca asked, are there any commonalities that you saw among the 32% that addressed all of their resource concerns? Who were these people?
Yeah, I would say that in general, these are producers that are, I guess, very progressive in what they do and how they operate their farms. And I think they kind of felt like it was a unique opportunity to kind of take advantage of Ron's time, but also to take advantage of the cost share, in this case, that was out there. And I would say, these were some of the farmer leaders in those watersheds too, that they kind of felt by example, they felt like, I better, better put my action where my words are. And so I think they wanted to be a good example to their neighbors that, hey, I'm kind of encouraging you guys to do this. I better show that I'm doing it too. So, and I think part of it too is some of those farmers, the last, 2016, 2013, and then 2018 and 2019, those have all been very wet years for us. And, I think our farmers recognize that, what we could get by with, maybe 20 years ago in terms of some of our practices, they recognize that to sort of address and be adaptable to some of our new climate regime that we have, especially rainfall, these intense but short duration rainfall events that we're getting in May and June, that we have to protect our farms and go a little bit more in terms of protecting and armoring our farms to some degree. And so I think on those particular farmers, I think their farms may have been hit a little bit harder than maybe others in terms of some recent rainfall events. And so they recognize the value of putting these additional practices out there.
Thank you. And Bowden asks, who led the information sharing partnership you mentioned at the beginning? Who contributed? Was the information from local, state, or regional research? What kinds of products were shared with the farmers?
Yeah, so that was pretty much my role is on the monitoring side of it, setting up the sites, managing the sites, and then having that, relaying that information back to our farmers. And again, as I mentioned, that was the whole reason why this project started, was to help answer key questions that our farmers had as we start to engage them on these watershed level type of efforts. And that's really why the Field to Stream partnership began, was to help address those key questions. And so I've been the lead on that, but over the years, we've tried to kind of relay that information back to our soil and water offices, other partners that could, certainly benefit from that information in their conversations with farmers. And we've tried to do different things like videos or fact sheets or things like that. That's been kind of our primary mechanism. But our goal is that others can use this, because what we find is that what we're finding in Southeast Minnesota, there's a lot of similarities, even though it's in that corner of the state. There's a lot of similarities to what we find with Wisconsin discovery farms, Minnesota discovery farms, in terms of a lot of that edge of field type of research. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to, try to compile that and kind of pull out a lot of those reoccurring themes. And again, critical time periods and critical source areas really kind of stand out in terms of some of those key messages from those data sets.
What was the average farm size in your focus project, and what percentage are HEL?
Yeah, good question. So each of the study watersheds that we were in were very different. So like, for instance, the Till watershed, that's a very flat watershed, 0 to 2% slopes, no HEL. As we move into the other two watersheds, I would say probably at least a third, maybe even to close to a half of the acres in some of those other watersheds were HEL. What was the other question? I'm sorry.
Just farm size and percentage under HEL.
Okay. Farm size, I would say in the Till watershed, some of those producers are very large. Probably average farm size is close to 2,000 to 4,000 acres. Some as large as 10,000 acres in terms of the amount of acres that they farm. In the other two watersheds, I would say average size would probably be in that 500 to 1,000 acre farm size.
We have a number of questions here, and I'm trying to quick decide how much we can get through in just a few more minutes here. Adrian asked, what were the sources of cost share funding? With the number of practices, was the process efficient, and were there additional steps for facilitating efforts with NRCS and FSA? That's a big question.
Yeah. So primarily we utilized EQIP, the leveraged an EQIP grant through MRBI, the Mississippi River Basin Initiative EQIP funding at that time. So we were able to leverage some federal dollars along with state dollars to the Minnesota's Clean Water Program that's administered by the Board of Water and Solar Resources. So we're able to leverage as much as we can. We try to leverage the federal dollars first, and then to extend our dollars across the area, we then also utilized the state dollars as well. And what was really beneficial through that process is we were able to offer up to 90% cost share for not all the practices, but majority of those practices to really bump up those cost share rates. So especially for grass waterways and water sediment control basins, those types of practices, for the most part, those farmers were able to get up to 90% cost share. I would say in terms of some of the hurdles that we ran into, that was actually one of the ones, unfortunately, that we ran into was, as many of you work with these programs, that they can be somewhat complicated and there can be quite a bit of paperwork involved with some of them. But, fortunately, we had really good partners to kind of work through that process, the soil and water districts, of course, and NRCS offices to work through that. But certainly, I think it is a challenge sometimes to get through some of that in a timely fashion. Get the engineering done and the paperwork done for the cost share. To roll that out within a relatively short amount of time can be a challenge.
Jean asks, was ACPF run on the whole watershed and then used to select the 3 target areas, or ACPF run only on the target areas? And what, if any, connection could you make between the target areas and the larger watershed in terms of overall practice needs?
Yeah, so we ran ACPF just on the small watersheds. So it was roughly 10,000 acres. And I guess I'm not quite clear on that, the second part of the question. If you want to repeat that again, Marcel.
What connection could you make between the target areas and the larger watershed in terms of overall practice needs? Like, you probably saw some patterns in which kind of practices were important on these landscapes. Were you able to interpolate out?
Yeah, I would say universally across all those 3 different landscapes, the till, the karst, and the bluffland karst study watersheds, I would say grass waterways, that was universal. That was a need throughout those watersheds. Of course, water sediment control basins, that tended to be more of a need as we got into some of the steeper topography. But I think in the steeper topography watersheds, a lot of those farmers were already utilizing, I would say, alfalfa, because we had a little bit more livestock in those watersheds. So they're utilizing alfalfa or had perennials in the rotation. So, those were practices that the farmers were already using. In the till watershed, I think the big challenge that we have in that area is, even with tile drainage, that watershed produces more runoff, not only through the tile system, but of course through overland runoff processes. And sediment control basins get very spendy and very expensive in that watershed because of the ability to route the inlet for the structure out to a stable outlet, let's say a drainage ditch. And so we've, in recent years, especially this last year, we've been actually trying to promote more prairie strips at the edge of field in that watershed as another alternative or another option to water sediment control basins in that area. So that's something that is kind of a side effect, I guess, of this walkover approach is Ron now is kind of promoting prairie strips in that headwaters region of the root.
Great. Kevin, I really appreciate your stories here. This is great. I'm going to cut off the questions. There's a few more. If you feel like going in and writing some answers to them, I know they would be appreciated because they're very good questions. But at this point, I'm going to move on to Dr. Joe Magner, who did some work down in Indiana. And also, yes, make note of Kevin's email address there and encourage people to contact him directly. So at this point, I will hand over to Joe. I believe I saw you in the room.
I'm here.
All right. Do you have a slide set you want to share?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, I guess, Kevin, you might have to unshare. Or, yeah, let's see, or am I
Yeah,
able to
yeah,
do
Kevin
that?
needs to stop sharing his screen.
Yeah. There we go. So while Kevin had a example of working with farmers individually, in Joe's case, we're going to switch to working with farmer organizations and community meetings and using ACPF in that context. And I can see your slides.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of sluggish here at the moment.
Kevin had that same problem. And I'm not sure if he had to switch to presentation view and then share after that, or how he managed to get it to work.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop here for a second, go back. Something. Okay. All right, let's try it again.
Okay, it's not in presentation mode, but we do see your slides.
Yeah, I'm clicking on presentation mode, but it's not wanting to respond very well here.
That's funny. Kevin had the same problem. I'm not sure.
Okay, I think I got it now.
Perfect.
All right, well, I'm going to share a lot of the story is going to be similar to what Kevin shared, only in a different state and a different landscape. I think, you know, you're probably going to hear some reoccurring themes, but we took a little different approach, mostly because this was a conservation innovation grant that was provided to the Environmental Defense Fund, who then turned around and essentially brought a team of folks together. I was asked to kind of lead that team, but we spent some time actually looking across the upper Midwest for a small watershed that we thought we could actually demonstrate the ACPF tool in. And so we found that in the Beargrass watershed in Indiana. Susie Steffen was the Wabash County Soil and Water Conservation District Executive Director, who grew up in the area and really understood the landscape, understood the farmers, knew many of them personally. Herb Manifold was a student at Manchester University at the time we started this project. He then became my graduate student, finished his graduate work, which is one of the publications that I think is in your file. Then he returned back to the area and spent another 3 years as their Section 319 coordinator. He's now moved on to a different company. Sarah Porter, who is the one that basically created the maps. So she's really the kind of the key player in pulling this together. And of course, you all know who Mark Tomer is. And then again, there were several other folks. Eileen McClellan with the Environmental Defense Fund was basically the person behind the funding for all this effort that went on. So the Beargrass Creek Watershed is in sort of north central Indiana, which essentially puts us into a glaciated area, and it's a relatively flat watershed, but very similar type of corn, soybean types of practices that you've already heard about today. There's essentially 14,000 acres, 84 or 85 total operators. 50 of them were sort of primary, but 32% of the watershed was managed mainly by 4 farming operations, which you know, it's nice to have if you've really got those 4 landowners well convinced about what you're doing, you can get a lot done. Obviously, that's not the case everywhere, but that was one of the reasons I think why we selected Beargrass Watershed is because of not only Susie's connection to the landowners, but that the 4 key landowners in this watershed were already working closely with the district and open-minded to kinds of different ideas and practices. Unlike Kevin, talked a lot about sediment. We'll switch gears here because we're going to talk a little bit more about nutrients. And in fact, this conservation innovation project was really funded to look at trying to get a 45% nitrogen reduction. In that this was linked back to the Gulf hypoxia. And so the key focus that we'll have here is really on tracking nutrients and understanding what's going in and what's out. And again, this was essentially Herb Manifold's master's thesis in building a nutrient budget, primarily a nitrogen budget for what was going on in Beargrass. So to do that, of course, we had to understand, how much manure was being applied, how much chemical fertilizer was being applied. But this is a watershed that had a lot of manure that was generated within it, and as you know, it costs money to sort of move manure any kind of great distance. So they all wanted to kind of keep their manure as close as possible to the source. So one of the things that Herb did then is there were surface water stations set up, and then there were essentially access tubes along with subsurface tile drainage outlets. And this is just sort of a schematic that kind of illustrates really the gist of Herb's thesis, which was, here was the manure that's essentially going on the fields. Then really from that, you've got rainwater that then is moving nutrient into the soil further, but there's the whole soil nitrogen pool is being dealt with, how much nitrogen is being managed within that soil nitrogen pool. And then really what's being taken up by the crops or cover crops in some cases, because they were already using some cover crops within the system. But a big part of what Herb was trying to understand then is how much nitrogen was staying within the root zone, how much of it was going below the root zone, how much of it was moving through subsurface tiles then into the Beargrass Creek. And in order to get at that, there were 2 gauge stations that were set up using automatic samplers, as well as looking at the stage discharge relationship of flow through Beargrass Creek. Very similar to what Kevin was doing in southeastern Minnesota. This just shows kind of, again, the Beargrass Creek watershed. The yellow dots here represent the gauge stations where we were able to get flow weighted mean concentrations along with the loads of nitrogen and phosphorus that were moving through the system. There's a fair amount of temp as well to look at the biology of the system. And so undergrad classes that came out from Manchester University would also do the index of biologic integrity by going up and down the stream and looking at fish and macroinvertebrates. And the red dots here just again refer to these access tubes that Herb installed to get a sense of the distribution of nitrogen that was in the soil zone. And this is, excuse me, this is the final map that Sarah Porter essentially produced for Beargrass Creek. And you can see there's a lot of different practices on here. There's a lot of different colors representing these different practices. I'm going to run through these a little bit so that you get an idea of the kinds of things that were suggested for Beargrass. And again, similar to what Kevin said, I mean, you know, grass waterways and water and sediment control basins seem to be a common practice through all these. Although, again, given that this is a flatter landscape and that we're primarily focused on nutrients, sediment was not that critical of a pollutant here to deal with as compared to the amount of nutrients that were coming through the system. There were, in Indiana, there's been a fair amount of effort already at the time of this study, which was basically back around 2013, 14, 15. And so there were folks that had already started doing cover crops, and they were as well encouraging some of their neighbors to look at cover crops. I think one of the things about cover crops in Indiana versus say cover crops up in say northern Minnesota is that here the weather really allows for that to happen. You know, this time of year and into November, it's not that big of a deal for them to really get cover crops out on their landscape because they know that cover crop can get started, it can be successful compared to the challenge of working in a cooler climate such as northern Minnesota. Given that a good part of the middle part of Beargrass Creek was in tile drainage, Sarah's work really then tried to highlight areas where there could be some type of controlled drainage, where again, we got some really flat slopes where the water table could be managed. And so we try to look at this as being a key factor associated with trying to manage excess nitrogen coming off the landscape, because what we know, whether it's in Indiana or Iowa or anywhere in the upper Midwest, is that where you have subsurface tile drainage, there's about a 10-fold increase in the export of nitrogen that's essentially leaking out of the soil zone and finding its way into the surface water, which in turn then can affect the index of biological integrity. So we try to look at this fairly closely, but one of the challenges with controlled drainage here is that a lot of the tile drainage systems were older systems, and to really make controlled drainage successful in this watershed, landowners would have to have stepped up and said, okay, we're going to abandon our current system and put in a whole new tile drainage system. And so even though there's the potential for that here, given the landscape, given the pollutant reduction we're aiming for, this particular practice was not necessarily all that well received by the landowners, even though again the potential was there if they were willing to make an investment in new subsurface tile drainage. A fair amount of effort then was looked at in terms of the riparian corridor, looking at multi-species buffers, looking at critical zone planting. And again, you can kind of see based here where the red blocks are, as well as the different shades of green and blue here, that there was a lot of potential for doing these kinds of buffers. But again, this because land is very expensive, and a lot is expected out of it. Taking cropland out of production and putting into perennial vegetation was a bit more of a challenging sell. And so, you know, the potential was there, and again, with the right presentation, with the right delivery, the right economic conditions, you know, some landowners did make some changes in terms of stepping up in terms of the riparian buffers, but it wasn't an easy sell. Two-stage ditches were actually more popular than I think what we sort of anticipated or thought. And part of that just is that in Indiana, there's a lot of push to get two-stage ditches in. In fact, I'd say Indiana is still probably the leading state in the country for two-stage ditches. And I think a lot of that stems back to at the county level, the county engineer, drainage engineer makes some of these decisions. And I think where some of these got started, and then there was some good communication across county lines, it seems as if though the two-stage ditch idea has been communicated in a way that not only the county officials, but also the landowners, the farmers, were seeing some value to putting in two-stage ditches. And so in spite of the cost of doing this, there seemed to be, we had a lot more success in getting some two-stage ditches into this this landscape than you would think. Denitrifying bioreactors were also popular because that wasn't taking land out of production. And so, again, you know, these are a little bit more expensive, but they did allow the landowner to continue to farm some of these areas. And it was a way for us to try to knock down the nitrate concentration coming out of the tile lines. Because again, the chief goal here was to get a 45% reduction of nitrogen, particularly the nitrate nitrogen that was coming through the system. And the way we did this is, I think, I like to refer to it as the watershed restaurant approach. In other words, similar to what Kevin has talked about in his sort of field walkover, we really relied on several individuals here to kind of create a restaurant type of experience for the landowners that were present in the watershed. So in essence, the ACPF was the menu that was produced by Mark, primarily by Sarah. And then I and Susie were sort of the waiter and waitress, and we interacted quite a bit as much as we could with some of the different producers. And then at Manchester University, the students were out there sort of, you know, doing the monitoring and sort of looking at the ingredients in terms of the nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations that were associated geographically within the watershed. And then Herb Manifold, he really was the chef involved here, because Herb was sort of taking all of this information, the output of ACPF, taking some of the interviews that were occurring with the individual producers, taking the data that was collected by Manchester University students, putting it all together, and then looking at and sort of analyzing and kind of coming up with a sort of prescribed, tailored type of set of practices for each landowner, so that it wasn't like, you know, initially, yes, here's the map, but when we got down to sort of looking at and talking about what was happening on an individual parcel of land, Herb was that key person that followed up after I and Susie had made some initial contacts with landowners, and Herb, as the chef, really tried to understand and take into consideration what was really going to be a dish that the landowner would want to engage with. And so, excuse me. down at the bottom here, you can see we did invite a number of landowners in. We held 2 landowner meetings where the first meeting we initially had half producers and then half agency folks that kind of came in, and we talked about some of the key factors related to the project area. And so we had about 21 farmers, some of the key producers in the watershed, show up for that meeting. And then we had a series of interviews where folks from Purdue came out in their social sciences department and looked at the landscape. They met with individual farmers in following up with some of the work that Susie and I had done. They were with us actually in some occasions just to kind of hear the conversation. But all in all, we did this combination of meetings where we gathered everybody together into a bigger room, one-on-one type of interviews, and then what I would call the shop meetings, meetings where it took place within their equipment sheds. And often there we tried to meet with more than one producer at a time. But we did several of those meetings where, again, we could hear what they were thinking. They could look at the menu that Sarah put together in terms of the ACPF output, make some comments back about, yeah, we agree with this or we don't agree with that. So in the end, I think they understood we were trying to use a tool to help provide more guidance, more tailored information for each of them to look at and consider. So, part of this was I've been working with BMP development and BMPs for well, nearly 4 decades. And again, Susie was the key link here. I wouldn't have been able to talk to anybody out there if it wasn't for Susie, who knew all these people, could call up and arrange for a time and get this whole thing initially started. And so, this ties back into what Kevin was saying, is that for that $50,000 investment in getting somebody like Ron out there, you just can't go wrong with that, because that is a catalyst to then leading to those critical conversations you need to have that then lead to actually getting the implementation out onto the landscape where it's needed. So here's essentially sort of the results of what took place over the course of 3 years. Is that in preparing the orders with the field data ingredients, we saw a couple 2-stage ditches that came forward. We saw a number of denitrifying bioreactors, but probably the one that surprised us the most was that there were several of the key landowners who were very interested in looking at channel modifications and utilization of oxbows within the watershed. Now, this was something that we didn't necessarily go into this with. I mean, that's something that ACPF didn't really map out initially, but through the course of conversation and talking about the riparian corridor, talking about riparian management and the type of management that could be done on land that wasn't being taken out of production, this caught their attention. And because they all wanted to try to reduce the amount of nitrogen that was leaving the watershed. And they were willing to do cover crops. They were willing to do the things that they could do on their landscape. But they felt like that the edge of the field into the riparian corridor was really where some advances could be made that still allowed them to remain economically viable. So this just, again, shows part of the Beargrass Creek watershed, and where you see these red lines, these are areas where there are oxbows that could be potentially reconnected again. Historically, these red areas represented the full length of Beargrass Creek, but as a result of some fluvial processes within the channel, these areas, these oxbows were disconnected. But these oxbows are rich in organic soil. They're rich with wetland species. And so in essence, instead of putting little wetlands onto the landscape, we've got linear wetlands within these oxbow systems that the producers were very interested in looking at it and trying to understand. You know, and this just gives you a little bit of the mechanics behind how an oxbow is formed. So it's a result of the sinuosity of a stream, where that sinuosity starts to then breach from one point to another. The channel, the circular part of the channel here can be cut off, and now there's a sort of a shortening of the channel, and water that's moving through the channel that has less time to interact with the soil, with the organisms that are contained within a slower moving kind of water moving through an oxbow. So I realize that, you know, I'm only probably telling part of the story here. There's a whole nother paper that's been put into your file that was written by Sarah Church. She was one of the researchers from Purdue University that then really looked at more of the whole social dynamics of what we did here on this project. And so again, it's a similar story to, I think, what you've heard this morning, but it was one that was a little bit more top down, in the sense that the Conservation Innovation Grant provided the base funding for the various people that were involved in this, and provided some of the necessary funds to get things launched. And then again, using Section 319 money that was made available to the Watershed, and her basically moving into that position after he finished his master's degree, he was able to sort of further develop the nutrient budget and look at the reductions that then were able to come with the implementation of the various array of practices. So that's all I have, Marcel.
Great, Joe, thank you. I like your last comment there about is just there's similarities in these three stories, but they're also coming from different angles. And your story, there's a real dominant leadership from the university community, as well as Environmental Defense Fund and the CIG funding. Kevin's story that's led by the State Department of Agriculture. And then in Iowa, that effort was really dominated by the Iowa Soybean Association, as well as state agencies. The point being that there's a lot of different users for the ACPF that can drive this. And so finding who your partners are and where the strengths and resources are, it's really important. You have one question here from Bowden about how are two-stage ditch compatible sites placed on the landscape, since it is not in the ACPF output?
Well, what ACPF is doing is giving you an understanding of what the top of the bank might be down to the bottom of the channel. And what ACPF was able to do was make an estimate of what was maybe in size or less than size. The highly incised stream channels represented areas that we could pull back some of the upper bank and create a bench within the geometry of the stream channel to create a two-stage ditch. And that was really kind of the goal then of building that bench, was to provide the opportunity for water that's coming from further upstream to interact then with the vegetation on that bench. But yeah, two-stage ditches are something that they're popular in Indiana, but I would say they haven't necessarily caught on in other states. But if you're interested in two-stage ditches, we do have a number of publications that we put out. Folks in Ohio have teamed up with us in Minnesota, and we have put some publications out on two-stage ditches, although again, Indiana has been the shining star of two-stage, or the shining state of two-stage ditches.
So in other words, you use the stream network analysis that happens at the beginning of the ACPF toolbox, and then the riparian assessment, which actually has been really enhanced since, Joe, you were using it in Beargrass. And now it has a lot of different components to it that you can really get a good sense of what the character of the stream network is, or in this case, the ditch network. And you can use that information in some different ways, and in this case, applying it to the two-stage ditch analysis. The next question is, how did you market the public meetings in particular regarding means of communication as well as content highlighted in that initial communication? You had high participation.
Yeah, and that goes back clearly to Susie. Susie, pretty much word of mouth, either got on the phone or made a personal visit to those landowners and got them there. So, I mean, it just took a little bit of extra effort on her part, but she was the catalyst that made that happen.
Yeah, we've got a little theme here of the importance of the individuals and who's the messenger as well as what the message is.
Yeah. Yeah, I surely could not have done that. They would have said, who's this gray bearded guy from Minnesota doing down here?
Good. Any other questions for Joe? I was taking a few notes here today, and again, in your slide set, added a few take-home lessons that all three speakers talked about. So you can take a look at that. By Thursday, I'm hoping you will have come up with some inspirations about how you want to apply some of these ideas that you heard from these three people in your own situation. And so if you can come on Thursday with some ideas of how you want to integrate ACPF into your work, and then we'll have Emily Usher, who's a social scientist, and Jessica Nelson, who has a boatload of GIS technical experience running the ACPF. And they're going to talk about some tips and logistics and so on for how do you make this work in your setting? What are the considerations and for using it and adapting it in your setting? Any other questions? And do you have any other comments for people as we wrap up today?
Yeah, I'll share my screen quickly and share a little bit of information on ACPF resources. Was that docked for today, Marcel?
Yes, yep, that's.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just want to mainly share, give an overview of folks of what ACPF training resources are out there for you as you're thinking about how ACPF would pertain to use within your state or within your watershed. Hopefully now everyone has seen the ACPF website, but perhaps not, because I know the registration for this event was through a Zoom link, but this is the ACPF website. That's going to be kind of your one-stop shop for ACPF resources. And that's the URL there. As you can see, when you come to the website, there is information about ACPF, but you probably have seen most of that now or gotten that most from folks during these last two sessions and the session on Thursday. There is access to get ACPF on the site, as well as then the training and support. And so I just want to real quick go over some of the options for folks in terms of training and support, so that you're aware and can point other people too. I know a lot of the folks here are either maybe not going to be running it themselves, or you might run it yourselves, and you might work with the GIS technician to run it themselves. So how can you point them in the right direction? If someone is already prepared with and knows ArcGIS, they can go right to Get ACPF and download it. That said, even if they have, GIS knowledge, doesn't mean they're going to be able to run the ACPF just right off the bat with no instruction. So under our training and support, we do have an ACPF technical training that's free and easy to access for everyone. So that's something, if you're working with someone who knows GIS but doesn't know ACPF, they can go to that site, take this course. We actually have it set up now where you can actually take it either, and access it at any time, or you can log in and access it and also earn 7 soil and water management CCA CEUs as well. But it goes through the different modules, and this is really the course that the folks in the technical cohort training are taking right now. They're just doing it with a little bit more instruction and guidance from our instructors. But that is available to everyone on the course. And they can go ahead and use that. If they have ArcGIS, they'll have to download TOG DEM, which I know Josh talked about last time, but that is free to use. And you'll have to get the DEM data as well for your state. I know Josh pointed to where it's available for Iowa and Minnesota. You can certainly reach out to our team if you're having questions about where it is. A GIS specialist within your state would most likely know where that DEM data is available for your state. I also know that several people had reached out expressing interest in that technical cohort training. So this is a training where we really use the modules that are on the website, but we do it a little bit more hands-on. We have weekly course check-ins with our instructors. So I just want to let you know, we are in week 4. Actually, this is week 5 of that course, but we are hoping to host additional cohort style trainings. If you know folks that want to learn how to use that, they have intermediate GIS knowledge, or if you yourself wanted to take it as something to know about as well. So one of the things I mentioned in here, and Josh mentioned it before, but I think it bears just reiterating real quick. So obviously you need the software to do ACPF, but you also need this right here, which is the land and soil and land use data. And that's available through the ACPF watershed database. And so this is just a snapshot of what databases are available right now. So I think that's helpful to see. I know we have a lot of folks from Nebraska on the call today. You can see all of Nebraska's done. We have folks from Illinois, all of Iowa, all of Minnesota is done. Indiana, I know some of you guys from Indiana are on the call here, as well as Ohio, and you can see we do have some areas done and not all of the areas. So that's just something to know. We do have it that you can digitize the fields yourself, but obviously that's a more involved process. So I just wanted to, I do think it bears reiterating. There is a ACPF resource library on the website that has information on that technical help here. It also has more in-depth examples of ACPF in use. And so you just heard a lot of those, but let's say you heard that and you thought it was really interesting and you wanted to share it with a colleague, but you don't know if they're going to listen to the recording of this workshop. We actually have 2-page printouts of those case examples of Kevin, Joe's, and I believe the one Carl spoke about too. So you can go and provide that to folks and, send it off their way. We also have a wealth of the ACPF publications that really talked about the basis of the application. These are some of the technical resources that are available on the website. But since it's 11 o'clock, I'll just go straight down here to these ACPF tools. And so I mentioned these use examples that are on the website, but there's also, tips for using ACPF with stakeholders that's based on some of the research at Purdue, and also a number of graphics on how to use ACPF in watershed planning. So this can be helpful, again, if you guys are thinking about how to use this in your own work and you want to communicate it with your colleagues. This can be a great way to really talk about that and to use that when you're communicating it and getting other folks involved. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the importance of that here with the use examples that we heard today. All right, I'll stop sharing, Marcel.
Thank you, Anne, for all those goodies.
Yep, they're all on ACPF, ACPF4watersheds.org. So just wanting to make you guys aware of those.
Anything else? Otherwise, I think we're done until Thursday.
All right, great. Well, we should have a great conversation Thursday about how to present and display the ACPF results. We haven't had this one quite as much before, so I'm excited to listen into it. I will go ahead and email out this recording to folks afterwards, so you'll have it for your records.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.